Hi everyone. So today I'm going to show you a few different things and a few different steps to get you started on potentially a work that's going to be maybe more long-term if you would like, depending on kind of the size that you choose. But this is going to be a project today for us to explore and talk about color theory and to talk about different mediums. So we're going to get a little more technical today in terms of some processes that you could engage in your work with acrylic paint, just to be able to kind of handle and master that material a bit more. Before we do that though, I just want to talk a little bit about something that was on your supply list that's super important and something that I'm going to use to prep my surface for my painting that I'm going to be working on today for the project. So I have some gesso in front of me. So I have a big tub. If you've purchased gesso, you probably hopefully have a smaller container of gesso, but the gesso is really important, again, as I said, as a way to prep your surface. What gesso does is it essentially makes things archival and allows for the paint, acrylic paint or oil paint later on, to sit on top of the surface of the material, whether that's paper or canvas or any other kind of material, so that it doesn't seep into the material. So whenever it seeps into acrylic, and then especially oil paint, whenever it starts to seep into a surface, it makes it less archival, essentially meaning that it doesn't last as long, that it actually can start to break down the fibers in either the paper or the canvas, and then it'll last for, depending on the material you're painting on, it might only last up to 5, 10, 15 years, and we want to be professional artists and do it the right way, so we're going to use some gesso. Another thing that gesso does for us, besides making our paintings archival, it also allows the paint to be more saturated, essentially meaning the paint will be brighter as well. So if we kind of start our surface off with the gesso, it allows, again, the paint to sit on top of the surface rather than seeping into the surface, and again, it's going to create a brighter, more vibrant painting. So I'm going to go ahead and start today. I have this sheet of paper. This is, it wasn't on your list, but you can purchase it if you'd like. I love painting on this paper. It's actually a printmaking paper. It's called Reeves BFK. So it's like a cotton rag paper. So I usually like to paint on this, but the Bristol board is a little more, it's more inexpensive. So that's why I put it on your list, and it works fine as well. This one just has a little more tooth to it, a little more grit. Sometimes different things, like I like to use chalk pastels. They'll catch better on the paper, but it's totally a personal preference. So I'm just going to start today. This is much too large for me for this project. I want to make a smaller piece that I'm going to demonstrate for you today, or at least demonstrate the start of. So I'm going to go in. I'm actually just going to have this a few times just to make some smaller sheets of paper to work from. So this is 30 inches long. So you can do this too on your Bristol paper if you want to choose a different scale, but you didn't purchase the paper in the size that you actually want to do your project on. So you're going to go in, again, whenever you're doing this, or I guess I'm saying it for the first time, but you want to make a minimum of 3 measurements whenever you cut something down. So I'm using this green pencil here so it's nice and light in case it shows up later, the gesso can cover it. So I made a few measurements going down the middle of the page, and I'm just going to turn my ruler here. I'm going to have to stand up for this. And I'm going to go ahead and just place it down, make sure this is all on the table. And I'm going to place it down on the table, and I'm going to hold with my left hand the ruler, and I'm actually just going to rip the paper instead of cutting it with scissors or an X-Acto knife. This again is a personal preference, but whenever you rip paper like this, it's actually called, there's a technical term for it. It's called a deckled edge. So now I have 2 sheets of paper here. So I cut that perfectly down the middle. I think I'm going to go ahead and stick with this size. That feels good to me. You can make it smaller if you want, but now this is going to be the scale I'm going to work with today for our project is going to be about approximately 15 by 20 or 20 by 15. So I'm going to go ahead and set one of these aside, and I apologize for my messy studio. So this is my art studio. I'm in the process of moving my home and moving classrooms right now, so it's a little nutty at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead, really simple on gesso here. It's a very simple part of the process, but I'm going to go ahead and open my gesso, and then you should have purchased from the list a gesso brush. So that's going to be just a larger brush that you only use for gesso. That way you can keep it nice and clean and free of any other kind of paint materials so that you don't mix them. I think it's really smart to just keep a separate gesso brush. Of course, if you can afford a nicer gesso brush, that's awesome. I have a cheaper one, to be honest, and sometimes the little bristles will fall out because it's cheaper, and then sometimes they get stuck and I have to pick them out. It might even happen today. I have to pick it out of the gesso, which is kind of just a pain in the booty. So needless to say, I recommend if you can afford a nicer brush, great. If not, this will work fine. So I'm essentially just going to go right in and dip here into my my tub, and then I'm just going to simply apply the gesso right on to the paper, and making sure, something really important if you're using paper or if you're using rock canvas, you want to make sure you go all the way to the edges. I tend to find that I or other artists will often miss the edges of the paper or the canvas, and I'm reapplying often. Again, just with a lot of things with art, try not to be, I know that you pay money for these materials, but you don't need to be overly conservative with how much gesso you use, because it's more of a pain to kind of try to rub it into the surface rather than just reloading your brush. So I'm going to go ahead and apply a nice even coat, working my brush in all directions onto the surface of this paper. Now there's going to be, again, with gesso, there's going to be a lot of different preferences in terms of the surface quality or the surface texture. I don't mind seeing some of the brush strokes from the original gesso underneath my paint, but if you like really slick, really smooth surfaces, something that you can do as an option, I know a lot of artists do it if they prefer to have these really perfectly smooth surfaces to start. What you can do is you can actually let this dry in between the coats, and essentially you apply a really thick, maybe 2 to 3 coats if you want a smooth surface, and then you actually take sandpaper and water. You want to do something called wet sanding, where you maybe spray the surface of the dry gesso and take a piece of fine grit sandpaper and sand it down. But again, make sure that you spray it with some water, because dry gesso, when you sand it and if you breathe it in, it's actually really harmful to breathe that in. So if you prefer to have a really slick surface, I recommend applying a nice thick coat of gesso, probably 2. Again, it depends on the surface you're working with. And then you can actually sand it down later with just a little spray water from a spray bottle and some fine grit sandpaper. So again, I'm just kind of going in both. I'm trying to make it smoother just for the sake of the demonstration. Again, I don't really mind when there's brush strokes that are going on underneath, just because I tend to paint pretty like gestural marks so it doesn't bug me, but some people like really smooth surfaces. Okay, so I went in both directions, and essentially I'm just going to let this dry, apply one more coat, and then we'll move on, and I'll talk about our project today, some paint mediums, and some possibilities for you to start, including the artists that we just looked at.